Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. I want to welcome you to our 4 o'clock webinar. We're really excited to have all of you on board here. My name is Judy Browse, and I'm the Executive Director of NAAEE. And we're really happy to have you be part of our virtual conference. This is our second session today, and you guys are all in for a treat. We've got amazing panelists here ready to talk about highlights from the Research Symposium. Again, we're really sorry that we are not all together in Puerto Rico, but again, appreciate all the support that you have given both NAAEE and the people of Puerto Rico as they try to recover from Maria. If you listened earlier today, we are up to $20,000 for our Together for Puerto Rico fund, and all of that will go directly to Para la Naturaleza, our partner down there, who is doing just amazing conservation and education work across the island. So what we'd like to do today is just a quick note about how to use Zoom so you know how to submit questions, and then a little bit, tiny bit about the virtual conference info. But the biggest part of this is hearing from our moderator and panelists, talking about reflecting on 40 years of EE research in light of Tbilisi Plus 40, talking about intergenerational EE and generous scholarship, mainstays and innovations at the Research Symposium, a question and answer session, and then the future of EE research and a few closing thoughts. So to get started, want to make sure everybody knows how to ask a question. We will be fielding these questions, and our panelists will stop every now and then for questions so that we can feed them questions, and we'll also have a specific time that you can ask. So you can send them to all panelists, or you can send your questions to everyone. So hopefully everybody can see that on your bottom toolbar, and you can go to the chat section and add questions. If you have any technical problems throughout this presentation or this webinar, please contact Kristen or Sai, who are both here moderating everything, helping me with the questions. They'll be able to help get you online or deal with any questions. Because this is virtual week, we use the same Zoom login for the whole week. So it's a little bit different because we usually have a specific login for each one. So happy to see all of you join. And then just a very quick note about the webinars and live streams. This week we're doing 6 different sessions. We had a live stream at 2 o'clock. We have another one on Thursday. All the rest are webinars that will be on this platform on Zoom. And we're really happy to bring you some of the highlights from the conference. Of course, it's just a tiny bit, 6 sessions out of maybe 400, but it'll give you a taste of what's there. And you can always go to the virtual conference and download the program, both the general program and the research program. And also, we encourage you to upload what you were going to do at the Research Symposium or the regular conference. And all you need to do is go to NAAEE.org/conference/virtual. And when you see that note, click on it. It'll take you to your profile, and you can upload that. Whatever you want to put up there so that we have a virtual record of the 2017 conference. We had some really amazing presenters. So now it gives me just great pleasure to introduce Nicole Ardoin, a wonderful friend and colleague, and one of the smartest and kindest and hardworking individuals I have ever met. She is an assistant professor with a joint appointment in the Graduate School of Education and the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. She's also Stanford's lead researcher on the EE Works initiative that we're doing in conjunction with Stanford. And we're thrilled to be working with Nicole and her team on that project. Nicole's research focuses on environmental behavior as influenced by environmental learning and is motivated by place-based connections. In particular, she's interested in considerations of geographic scale, which is an understudied yet really important aspect of people-place relationships in a rapidly globalizing, urbanizing world. Nicole has current studies on the use of education, communications, and other social strategies in informal and community-based settings, including nature-based tourism programs to engage individuals and communities in deliberative dialogue, environmental decision-making, and informed conservation behavior. Nicole also researches the effectiveness of a range of environmental education and social science endeavors in achieving measurable and meaningful conservation results. And to that end, she works a lot with conducting evaluations with informal organizations like museums, zoos, aquariums, parks, and residential environmental education programs, with an emphasis on using innovative and non-traditional metrics and adaptive management approaches. She's also interested in philanthropic support of environmental education and emergent trends in the field of environmental education. Couldn't have a better moderator for this, and Nicole was the co-chair of the Research Symposium in Puerto Rico and put hours and hours and hours of work into that. And so at least we get to hear from Nicole. So Nicole, take it away.
Thank you, Judy. We're delighted to be here. I say we because I actually have a team of folks here with me today who are so excited to be joining all of you, and it's so nice to see you, Connie and Kathy Yoon, and actually Aryan is out there as well, and Alan. We are all so pleased to be here with all of you to bring you this virtual panel from the Research Symposium. Of course, we wish we were with all of you in person because building our community together, there's Aryan, building our community together in person is one of the things that we all look forward to all year. And we know that next year in Spokane it will be even more special since we've missed this year in between. So today we will just be giving you a few highlights from the Research Symposium. We have a great day planned, and we will be touching on a couple of the elements that we had planned over the course of this week. What we were trying to do and what we will be doing today is trying to really respond to a couple of things that we've heard over the past couple of years. Many of the people in our community have been indicating to us that what you really enjoy from the Research Symposium are the opportunities to be together in the plenary sessions, to spend time with the plenary panels and interacting around some of the big ideas in environmental education research. And as many of you know, this is a special year for the field of environmental education. It's 40 years since the 1977 signing of the Tbilisi Declaration, which has had a huge influence not only on the field of environmental education in terms of practice, but also in terms of how we conduct our research. And so that's a theme that's running through the conference, which you heard if you heard the earlier panel today. And then also we are going to be touching on that today in terms of the Research Symposium panel. So we'll begin with Aryan talking about that, and that's something we hope you'll walk away with from this hour is a sense of how that's really influenced us. So Aryan will be thinking about how, if we look back 40 years, what that's meant for the past 40 years, and looking forward, how that's influencing our work going over into the next 40 years. We then will have Connie Russell talking with us about what we think of when we think about intergenerational research, and thinking about the way that our field is really vibrant and how the researchers in our field are really thinking about how we interact with each other in terms of how we design our research questions, and how we're generous scholars in terms of really forming a community of researchers. So we've got young researchers, we've got more seasoned researchers who have a lot of time spent in the field, and how we think about designing our questions so that we can really spend a lot of time being mindful in our work together. And then we have Kathy Yoon Khalil, who works at the Seattle Aquarium. So she's someone who's working in a really exciting applied setting, and she'll be talking about the theme of mainstays and innovations in the field. And that would have been our closing panel at the conference, and will be our closing theme today, thinking about what are the ways that we design research questions, not only in an academic setting, but also in this setting that kind of bridges to practice a lot of times. And so this is a common theme that we have in the Research Symposium, which is this idea of what are the questions that are, and the stories that really motivate our research, and how do we think about those in really fresh ways. And again, that will wrap back to some of the themes that Aryan will have begun at the beginning. We also are fortunate to have Alan Reid talking today. He has been my co-planner for the Research Symposium this year, and Alan will be talking about a seminar and a webinar that we'll be holding later this year. And that is an opportunity to reflect on ourselves as researchers and reflect on our research community. So who are we as a research community? Who are we currently? Where do we want to go? And again, that's something that you'll hear as a theme throughout today. And Alan will talk about what some of those provocative questions are for us to think about ourselves as a research community, and think about who we want to be, not only now, but 40 years from now, and how do we get there between now and the future. So what I'd like to do is, I'm not sure if I have the power to advance the slides or if Aryan is holding that. I can try. Oh, I can try. Oh, I think somebody else is holding that, so I'll let somebody else advance the slide. And we can move forward to the next slide then. I think somebody else has got that.
Here we go.
Great. There we go. Oh, there you go. You got everybody's beautiful smiling faces there, so you can see. And we'll start with Aryan, go to Connie, go to Kathy, and then we'll wrap it with Alan, thinking about what the future of our research community looks like. We'll have everybody, as Judy mentioned, we'll have you go ahead and send in your questions as each of the speakers are continuing. And Alan and I will be holding those, and we'll save all of your questions for after Kathy Yoon speaks, and then we'll have about a 10 to 15 minute period there where Alan and I will moderate those questions. And so if you have anything that comes up for any of the speakers, please feel free to send those in, and then we'll have a discussion at that point. And again, then we'll end with Alan taking us through a reflection on who we want to be as a research community. So we'll go ahead and start with Aryan, thinking about Tbilisi and how Tbilisi has really influenced our trajectory as a field, and then thinking again about how that's really influenced where we're going in the future. So Aryan, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. It's not so easy to do that in a short period of time. To have a historical kind of representation that is maybe a little bit colored, because I live in a global north, you could say, in a Western context, and every country has a different history. So it's an oversimplified history of what I would call an evolving field. So I called it 1977 plus or minus 40. So going back some time to even 1937 and before, when we already had many countries starting nature conservation education, focusing on linking people with the web of life. The time where we had national parks being formed in the US already long before, and the foundations and associations trying to develop ecological literacy, a sense of understanding of nature, and creating support for policy for nature conservation. You could say very roughly that the main focus was on this connection with nature and the web of life, that the intended impact was literacy, societal support, and that some examples of that obviously were visitor centers, public awareness campaigns, nature programs in schools, and school garden programs. That goes way back, even well before Tbilisi. If you look at the research done in this area in terms of what is working and how to evaluate these kinds of campaigns and programs, there wasn't a whole lot of research, you could say. There was some empirical, analytical, more evidence-based research looking for causal relationships between these programs and the impact on literacy, trying to measure outcomes. And there was, maybe more importantly, anecdotal evidence through the literature. Think about Aldo Leopold's Ization County Almanac, based on Thoreau's work. That goes already back to the 1854, I believe, even. So there was that. And then we see later, and this is the late 60s, also when the Journal of Environmental Education started, 1969, I believe, first issue. After Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was before that even, then you see that environmental issues become a big concern. And then we see the birth of environmental education that initially focused mainly on trying to change attitudes and behavior. And in addition to other measures that were taken, like environmental legislation, impact assessment, and things like that, early environmental education was seen as a tool to change environmental behavior, you could say. And that is the 60s, early 70s. And then we get Tbilisi in 1977 and Belgrade even before 1975, where some new elements were added. It had to do with also with the economy, and had to do with equity, issues of the North and South, thinking globally, acting locally. So the later environmental education became more inclusive of different perspectives. If you look at the research, you could say, a lot of empirical analytical research taking place in the early phase of environmental education. Most research reported in the Journal of Environmental Education was of that nature, and focusing on maximizing predictability, minimizing and uncertainty, minimizing uncertainty, trying to come up with the tools and instruments that we could tweak and fine-tune to change behavior. But later in the 80s, and I think perhaps Tbilisi contributes to that shift a little bit, a more socio-critical approach. Action research-oriented approaches were rising, and we see in NAAEE in the late 1980s, early 90s, research symposia looking at different traditions in environmental education research. So we see a shift, and you could say in some ways the broadening of environmental education and the shift towards a more inclusive environmental education, looking at people, planet, prosperity, in a way was a predecessor for what in many countries today is called sustainability education or education for sustainable development. It was that avant la lettre, you can say. Activities, of course, we all recognize the more holistic approaches like the eco-schools, but also looking for the global connections to everyday items we use, like cell phones here in the middle, but also things like citizen science, water monitoring projects. The work of Bill Stapp was mentioned earlier today. Global Rivers Environmental Education Network was founded, GREEN. So that also included young people researching their own environment. So this was also relatively new. Today, we talk about worldwide sustainability education, environmental and sustainability education in parts of Europe at the moment, which started after the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, you could say, Local Agenda 21. And this is more about increasing citizen engagement, participation, increasing understandings of connections between environment, economy, culture, ecology, and how today's actions affect future generations. That intergenerational element was added. What is emerging at that time is also this notion of collaboration, working with different societal stakeholders, and these whole school approaches, changing systems is becoming more important. And the world of business is getting more interested. If you look at research, you could say socially critical perspectives are on the rise, but also interpretive, hermeneutical approaches, phenomenological approaches, ethnographic approaches, and again, action research, policy research is making an entry, and also some very novel approaches like arts-based approaches, but also still a continuous strand of empirical, more evidence-based research, which is, you could say, also needed. Then we move to what we would say maybe the future or the current situation, where it is actually going back in some ways to the early environmental education, the nature conservation approaches, where we need to also have that place-based sense of place, connectivity, a more relational approach to research, to pedagogy, greening of school grounds, urban agriculture is on the rise, transition movements are coming up, and how can education, capacity building, learning play a role in that? So this is where we are today in a way, environmental and sustainability education converging, where it's about a transition towards a more relational way of being in the world. If you look at examples, there are many of them, but it's about brokering learning, building connections and relationships, building trust, social cohesion, social learning, intentional communities such as eco-villages, transition towns, whole school approaches, local food, energy movements, cradle to cradle, closed cycle design, and we talked about the circular economy as well earlier today. These are new emerging themes that are very important at the moment. Research, socially critical research, interpretive and hermeneutical action research, but also, and this is relatively new, more dialogical approaches, post-normal science, where it's not just academic peers judging the quality of research, it is extended peers, having representatives from schools, from practice, from the business community, the world of governance, all making a vital, you could say, coalition of critical friends trying to co-create sustainability. I'll quickly wrap up by saying that in the future, and we'll talk more about it during the panel later, I think the Sustainable Development Goals will become more important also in establishing research agendas, where number 4 and 17 are, say, drivers or mechanisms that can help realize the other 15. I think that's important. The transition perspective, where we need to also become more disruptive of existing structures and patterns that make living unsustainable lifestyles easy and living sustainably difficult. So how can we create communities that breathe sustainability, schools that make living in a sustainable way the default, the normal, the new normal, if you will. And I think the more participatory research approaches where people are empowered to monitor their own environment, their own health, their own quality of life in their own communities will become more important, and bridging science and society will become the key in the coming years. That connects very well with the responsible research and innovation agenda that is sustainability science on the rise at the moment. So disruption will be part of it. Transgressive forms of research even will be maybe in the Tbilisi +50 perspective 10 years from now, when we're also closing in on the year 2030, which is the year that the United Nations agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals will need to be reached. Let me end with maybe emphasizing the importance to connect these alternative forms of research, and then the GEEP, the Global Environmental Education Partnership, will also look at research, innovation, evaluation, and new forms that can help us go to the next level, which is not so much optimizing our current ways of living and our current system, but really rethinking them, making the ordinary less ordinary, asking difficult questions about how we live that can be confrontational, disruptive, so that we can actually transition towards not just doing the things we do better, but doing better things altogether. That will be the key for sustainability and living more lightly on the earth and more equitably in the earth in the future. So to sum up, I think if we want to move towards environmental and sustainability education that has impact in the future, and the kind of research that goes with that, we need to look for boundary crossing opportunities, connect citizens to our research, bridge research, education, and awareness raising, also using social media. I think we can do a lot with social media that we haven't done yet. Adopting a systems approach, obviously not new in the field of environmental education, but possibly linking to the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, might help with that. We should utilize diversity and multiple perspectives to be creative, but also to be able to come up with alternative solutions to these stubborn, resilient patterns that keep us from changing. So it also has a political aspect, asking, and that's the last point, what is my research strengthening in society? What am I amplifying? But also, what is it ignoring or weakening? What voices is my research maybe silencing unwillingly, unintentionally? And how can we bring those voices into the research? So that's what I'd like to close with. I hope there will be some questions about this. The last slide that you're looking at is a very, I think, important report from UNESCO. It's the Global Education Monitoring Report from 2016. It's Education for People and Planet, Creating Sustainable Futures for All. I recommend it to everyone. It's an open access, available in all the UN languages, freely downloadable, well referenced, well illustrated, well researched, easily accessible. And it could be a good resource for both researchers and practitioners and policymakers. So Nicole, let me give it back to you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Arjen. And first, I will start by saying I apologize. I was so eager to get into your talk that I did not do a proper introduction. I will start by saying that I'm glad you brought up this resource. We will at the end make sure that we share with everybody who's registered for the webinar, as well as on EE Pro, all the terrific resources that people are sharing. And I will also note that Arjen is he is the UNESCO Chair of Social Learning and Sustainable Development, and so this is one of the resources that he's produced in that capacity. He is also a professor of transformative learning and social ecological sustainability at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and he has also been a great supporter and member of NAAEE for many years and an active participant in the Research Symposium. He is also the Carl Bennett guest professor in Education for Sustainable Development at Gothenburg University in Sweden, which is where he is primarily based at the moment, right? And he's here in DC with us at the moment. He's also a special advisor on the Global Environmental Education Partnership and has been doing a lot of work in research and support in that role as well. So thank you so much, Arjen, for participating today and for those really interesting perspectives and for setting up the Research Symposium panel discussion today. We'd like to turn to Connie Russell, who is with us from Lakehead University. And Connie is going to, as we mentioned, is going to be talking about intergenerational perspectives. And Connie is a professor in the School of Education at Lakehead University, where she studies the intersections of environmental education and social justice education. She's particularly interested in critical animal studies and multi-species pedagogies, as well as gender and education. And she also, we are sad to not be in person this week for many reasons, not the least of which is that she was going to be hosting a lunch for us this week, where we were going to be talking about, she hosts the ecofeminist group within the environmental education discussion forum. And it's been a very active and very thoughtful group, and we really are so grateful to Connie for always demonstrating so much leadership and mentorship within that group. So Connie, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you to talk about intergenerational research within environmental education.
Great, thank you, Nicole. So good afternoon, everyone. For the Research Symposium in Puerto Rico, which I'm obviously sad to miss and very concerned about the folks there, I was asked to speak on an intergenerational panel discussing the past, present, and future of environmental education research. Given I'm the only member of the panel who was able to be here today and is clearly the oldest member from the original panel, I want to make sure that my remarks are particularly relevant to newer scholars, which means in part challenging other oldsters like myself to spend their privilege and speak out and act on troubling issues facing the academy generally and environmental education research specifically. There's a growing body of writing on the neoliberalization of the academy. One impact of that is the adjunctification, namely that there are fewer permanent positions for new scholars. In universities in Canada and elsewhere, retired or departed professors are not being replaced in sufficient numbers, and a growing number of courses are being taught by contract lecturers, most of whom would prefer to have a tenure-track position. Alas, such positions remain few and far between in many fields, including our own. Contract lecturers, or adjuncts, are paid far less than their permanent colleagues and often find themselves juggling multiple courses per term alongside other work, leaving little time to conduct research or write. The longer they are in such a position, the harder it gets to remain competitive if they are not able to keep publishing. And yet they are often blamed for the situation and seen as damaged goods whenever they do apply for positions. Another challenge facing adjuncts is the spotty access they can sometimes have to library collections. If they are not teaching at a university in a given term or year, they may not have library privileges, precisely when they might have more time to spend on research and writing. This is one reason amongst many that I am a fan of open access publishing, which Ariane just mentioned. I was pleased to hear that that publication is open access. I believe that art research should be available to everyone who wants to see it, not just those who can independently afford to pay for subscriptions or who have access through their institutions. That includes not only adjuncts, of course, but academics working around the world whose libraries may not have adequate budgets, as well as community-based researchers, our own research partners or participants, and other members of the public who are interested in what we have to say. It is not gone unnoticed that academic institutions already support faculty research by paying our salaries and housing our offices and labs. Yet they then find themselves having to pay to see our research results. They are, in effect, subsidizing large publishing corporations through library budgets that presumably could be spent in far better ways. This is an excellent example of directing public monies towards private profit, a hallmark of neoliberalism. That open access publishing movement is thus in part a response to what Taylor Price and Anthony Pudafat have called the crisis of profiteering in academic publishing, whereby, and I quote them here, for-profit corporations in charge of most academic publishing continue to develop monopolies and stretch library budgets by steadily increasing subscription fees. This state of affairs in academic publishing has been defined as the cereals crisis, referencing the hyperinflationary practices of for-profit, peer-reviewed journals, which, from the mid-'80s to the mid-2000s, rose more than 2.5 times faster than inflation. In a recent study of open access journal editors in Canada, and I admit I was one of them, Price and Pudafat found then that many were motivated by a desire to resist such capitalist profit motives in academic publishing. Another common motivation was removing barriers for authors and readers. If we really are seeking to make a material difference as scholars, surely widening the potential audience of our work is an important strategy. Open access is not without its challenges, of course, and these go well beyond the workload associated with editing an independent journal or finding a way to pay for expenses without subscription revenue. Predatory publishers have negatively impacted the reputation of legitimate open access journals. And this is particularly challenging in a neoliberal audit culture where impact factors materially impact the professional lives of many academics. So those without tenure are not to be blamed when they seek to publish in high impact journals controlled by the big publishers. So here is one place where
Connie, your connection is breaking up a little bit, Connie.
By submitting manuscripts to independent journals. This can help legitimate those journals as much as possible. So this now brings me to the politics of this have been gaining attention.
Hey, Connie, I think you're on mute. Can you hit, there you go. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Oh, what a bad time. I couldn't have gone disappearing whenever, you know.
Do you want to repeat just what you said in the last minute or so? It's been great. It was just broke up for a little bit.
Okay, so how about so I think I was talking about that established scholars can publish in independent journals, which is really an important way to legitimate them, as well as cite articles from independent journals as much as possible. So, okay, now I'll get back on track here. So this brings me now to the politics of citation. The impacts of citation practices have been gaining attention recently, particularly from anti-racist and feminist scholars. For example, writing about the discipline of geography, Carrie Mott and Daniel Cockayne analyzed the continued underrepresentation, and marginalization of women, people of color, and those othered, and observed how particular voices and bodies are persistently left out of the conversation altogether. In education, Eve Tuck and colleagues ask, who do you choose to link and recirculate in your work? Who gets erased? Asserting that the practices of citation make and remake our fields, making some forms of knowledge peripheral. In environmental education, attention has been directed to these issues and how certain voices, methodologies, and intellectual traditions continue to be marginalized, even those with rich histories in the field, such as those grounded in feminist and biocentric scholarship, environmental justice, anti-racism, and indigenous knowledges and decolonization. For example, in a forthcoming article in the Journal of Environmental Ed, Denise Mitten and colleagues sarcastically suggest that women researchers appear to be wearing invisibility cloaks. They observed, for example, that the Wikipedia entry for significant people in outdoor education listed 17 people, none of whom were women. They also noted how ideas raised in the field by female scholars years ago were not taken up in a serious way until, in an example of mansplaining and publishing, men started writing about the topic and doing so without acknowledging the earlier contributions of women. In 2003 at the Alaska conference, I raised the issue of representation when I read the list of 8 or so researchers who were leading a pre-conference workshop on Research 101, and I noted that they were all white males. As often happens when I open my mouth in such settings, I was then promptly asked to fill the gender gap. I found myself giving an impromptu lecture on feminist environmental education research. In a keynote talk for the Research Symposium 2 years later, Justin Dillon also raised a concern about the lack of gender representation. The following year, Martha Monroe and I were asked to be keynote speakers at the Research Symposium. So there has been some movement, but it is still not unusual to see an all-male panel or an all-white panel in our field. And such marginalization matters. As Mott and Cockayne suggest, the choices we make about whom to cite and who is then left out of the conversation directly impact the cultivation of a rich and diverse discipline. Of course, one cannot cite what one has not read. In a recent editorial, Alan Reid recommended that we think about how open we are to being ordered by others' ideas, as evidenced by our reading habits. So I ask you, who do you read and take inspiration from? Do you keep going back to the same authors repeatedly? And are they of a certain vintage, skin tone, or gender? From an intergenerational point of view, what might it mean when the recognized elders of the field are mostly white and certain histories of the field erase the contributions of women, racialized and indigenous folks, the working class, and others, as well as particular theoretical traditions and methodological approaches? Like Alan, I agree that attending to who one reads and who one does not is important. And I argue attending to who one cites and who one does not is as well. So too is ensuring credit is given where credit is due, rather than appropriating ideas. For example, it was feminist science scholars who first identified the limits of objectivity, but their contributions have been erased by many. How long before an idea that's gaining increasing currency, like intersectionality, becomes a meaningless buzzword and its origins in Black feminist thought are lost in time? Doing one's homework by gaining a sense of historical trajectories and acknowledging those who have laid foundations are part of what I've called generous scholarship. When I first started playing around with the idea, I was mostly focused on the ways in which researchers publicly engage one another's work. And I was concerned about the way in which the academy encourages adversarial discourse. It is so easy to resort to slagging one another in manuscript reviews, in publications, or at conferences. I admit I struggle with this sometimes myself. I'm part of this culture after all, which is partially why I'm interested in the concept. And while I do think there are times that indignation and anger need to be expressed in the face of injustice, for the most part, I think it is possible to be critical as scholars without being dismissive or mean. We are a community of scholars, and I wager we can accomplish more by being generous with one another and working together to hone our ideas, advance scholarship in our field, and make a material difference in the world. I'm sure I've exceeded my time limit now, so this seems like a good place to stop.
Thank you so much, Connie. That was fantastic and such important and provocative ideas. I really appreciate it. And now I want to go look at my list of what I've been reading. So excuse me for a moment while I go rush off and start reading. That was terrific. I really appreciate how thoughtful that was, and I hope that everybody who is listening is also really thinking about that. It also is really important, I think, for those of us who are assigning others reading lists to really think about kind of what we put on those lists for our students and colleagues as well. So thank you so much. We are going to now go to Kathleen Khalil, who is here representing the theme of mainstays and innovations and is of the next generation of scholars. I think it actually fits really nicely with the theme that Connie was just raising as well. And I'm delighted to introduce Kathleen and really grateful that she's also here with us today. And again, I also want to recognize all three of our panelists today. I know that this was kind of a change up from what we had originally asked all of you to do, and I appreciate all of you kind of being willing to go with it and change what you initially thought you were going to be presenting. So Kathleen is the principal evaluator at Seattle Aquarium, and as we described at the beginning, she's going to be speaking about kind of looking back over what we normally cover in terms of the research symposium and how we think about the way that we represent the stories of our research, as Connie was kind of pointing to what is kind of the way we usually do our work. And then also how do people, especially Kathleen, who's working in a non-traditional setting, how does she think about coming up with new ideas for her work, and where does she find innovation in her work? Kathy Yoon has a PhD in science and environmental education from Stanford, where I had the pleasure of working with her. She also has a background working in zoos and aquariums and natural history museums, and she's been working in that field for a long time. She started working as a zoo volunteer at the Oregon Zoo when she was a teenager, and so has really been thinking about this informal setting for a very long time. She is also working with a number of other zoo and aquarium professionals in thinking about empathy and in the kind of perspectives that engenders in zoo and aquarium visitors, and so has been thinking from a really interesting kind of non-traditional perspective on research in those settings. So we're delighted to have you with us today, Kathleen, and thank you for being the person who's kind of taking us forward and thinking about innovation in our field of environmental education research.
Yeah, happy to do so. So I guess go to the next slide. Perfect. So it's really great to be here. I think if we were at the research symposium, I would have been taking notes this whole time about everything that I was hearing and synthesizing those into some big, awesome ideas. But unfortunately, not being able to hear everyone's amazing presentations, I'm pretty much going to talk about exactly what Nicole talked about, which is a lot of the work that I'm doing and things that are sparking my interest lately and trending topics that I've been seeing around our field. Next slide. Great. So there's a lot in this session that I see reflected in the broader field of EE lately about inclusivity, diversity, and equity, and a lot about whose voices are being heard, why, when, and how we're accessing those voices. So that's something I'm seeing a lot in the environmental ed community within zoos and aquariums, and also within the broader research and practitioner fields. And along with that, I'm seeing a lot, next slide, about the idea of co-creation, about involving people in the people who either are affected by the programs that we are producing or who are directly involved in those programs, and letting them be part of the process, inviting them to be part, encouraging them to be part of the process that we are engaging in when we do research. So along with that, there's a lot of, way too much to talk about in 10 minutes, but there's a lot there about cultural competency, whose voices we include and how we develop those relationships between researchers and practitioners, and the accessibility that we allow through our work to be able to translate the good findings that we have in the research world over to practitioners. Go to the next slide. One of the main things I want to talk about, though, is this idea of emotionality and affectivity in environmental education. So as Aryan wonderfully laid out, I was like, perfect segue to what I'm going to talk about. This has been part of the evolution of environmental education for a while, this idea of focusing on the attitudes, affects, and emotions behind environmental education research. Now, there's two separate directions. We could have a big, long conversation about emotionality of researchers and what it does for us to be involved in a practice such as this in a time that's such as the one we're living in. And I will defer to people like Connie who know way more about that to speak to that idea, although it is a very rich, fruitful, and exciting area as well. But what I would love to talk about is the focus on affectivity within the environment, focus on affectivity and affective outcomes within environmental education practice. So as Nicole mentioned, I am part of a research team that is looking on empathy towards wildlife, specifically as fostered through zoo and aquarium education. So I'm going to give you the outline. I'm going to dive deeper into this project, but also recognize that it's not brand new to the environmental education world. None of the things I'm saying are brand new. I just think they're trending and emerging in maybe a new tidal wave of research. And then also use that as kind of symbolic, I think, of a lot of the other areas in which we are starting to focus more of our attention. So the Empathy Project, you can go to the next slide. Great. The Empathy Project, barnacles are here for a very specific reason, so I'll tell you why. The Empathy Project was originally started because we thought that this was kind of an easy win for the zoo and aquarium community. Like, we bring people into our institutions, and of course they're going to feel empathy for animals. That's great. Like, that's something we know we are doing. But as soon as we opened the Pandora's box, it was like a Pandora's explosion volcano. There was just so much there that we hadn't even anticipated, so much we didn't understand, and so much we didn't know that we were doing in that space in the first place. So what we came to, we have been working in a multi-institutional research team, which I think is another very important thing to highlight. It's been, within our small team, it's been ourselves, the Seattle Aquarium, the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium, and the Woodland Park Zoo. And myself and a lady from the Woodland Park Zoo are meant to be speaking at the main conference on this empathy topic, but there are definitely going to be strands brought in to the research symposium. But I think that that synthesis of institutions working towards a common goal with, academically rigorous research going on in a practitioner-focused way was an extremely, and is an extremely important part of that project. Additionally, we are one part of a larger project that's happening throughout the United States with a variety of institutions who are working in this area. So when we were looking at this, our main idea was behind the intentionality of developing empathy towards wildlife. So while there were a lot of things, through our research, we came up with 6 best practices for developing empathy towards wildlife. And we are specifically at the aquarium thinking about animals that don't have faces, like barnacles, animals that maybe people don't even think are not rocks. So we were kind of starting from a space where, yes, it's very easy to feel empathy for an otter and very hard to feel empathy for a barnacle. So what best practices transcend the animals that we're working with and get people to that empathy place, no matter what the species of interest. And so through these best practices, we developed a set of measurement tools and indicators for how we know that these things are happening, and realized that it's not just about creating affective emotions in our programs, it's about doing so intentionally and mindfully, and making sure that affect and emotions weren't just a byproduct of the experiences we were producing, but they were the focused outcome of our learnings. And so that was a really big moment for us. And through this work, we've shared it with we've directly shared it in workshops with a half a dozen informal education institutions, and indirectly through the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education and a variety of other other outlets, reaching probably around 50 or 60 institutions within the AZA who are directly interested in adding empathy-based programming to their work. Go to the next slide. Yep, great. So this collaboration, these pictures are just meant to highlight kind of the atmosphere in which we're working, and understanding that all of the things that we're doing in this project and in any other project are not just based in front of a computer and, you know, by diving into literature, although that's a very important part of it, but at every step of the way, ground truthing and creating this knowledge with the people that we're working with and the people who will ultimately be delivering the programming that we are creating. And so I'll pause right there because there's so much more to say, and I do want to give a little bit of homage to what Nicole was saying about how we come up with some of these innovations, and as a new researcher, how we come up with the pathways that we take. And just say that, you know, this project, as quickly as I ran through it just now, is also emblematic of how we are identifying new sources for innovation within the practitioner field. So a lot of what we're doing is based on now going back and ground truthing some of the quote unquote truths that we thought we knew all about within our practice. So I think this is also mirrored in our acceptance and our dedication to evaluation within the informal science education field. As Aryan said early on, there were a lot of anecdotal evidence and a lot of more passive approaches to evaluation, whereas now, even in the last 5 years, the uptick in evaluation interest within informal education practitioners has been phenomenal, in my opinion, and marked. And so I think that's a very important theme that transcends evaluation and goes into research as well. This idea of how do we know what we think we know about our field, and how can we add more rigor behind those research topics so that we understand both from a practical aspect and from a research aspect what those practices really mean and how we do things more effectively within our field. So phew, that was a lot, and I said it really fast, and there were a lot of things in there, but I hope that sparked some questions for people who are listening. There's a lot to unpack here, but in the end, for us, innovation comes from the intersectionality between multiple fields and ideas and thoughts, and by using co-creation, we can take into account all of those amazing perspectives that people are coming to us with and use them to drive a more advanced practice. I'll stop there.
Okay, so this is Alan Reid, and I'm pleased to be able to join this illustrious panel, and it's so great to think about the kinds of conversations and provocations which have been raised here. And can I just encourage people who don't feel necessarily that they've got the time or the space to ask a question to keep a hold of your questions and use the EE Pro Research and Evaluation Group as a place to continue the conversations after this particular event. I was just really struck by the depth of thought and consideration and the ability of our speakers to really squeeze a huge amount of high quality stuff into a very small space. So can I just thank you for doing that, and hope that others are starting to formulate some of the questions which they want to have posted to the panel members. Just a couple of things in reverse order of the presentations. Kathleen, one of the things which you really made me think about is what kind of empathy do barnacles have for researchers and for the learners which go there? There does tend to be an asymmetry in that we're encouraging species dialogues largely in one direction. I don't know what the Barnacle Journal of Environmental Education is like, but I do think there are some interesting ways of rethinking who are in our communities and what we do there. I know that's a bit of a jokey type question and reflection, but I think it's one of those things which gets at that harder point that Connie raised about what makes a material difference by the types of questions we pursue. And if we do take into account some of the different themes which intersect and are intersectional and speak to intersectionality. And again, those divisions and splicings can be really important for the way we think about who gets to speak at events, who gets to review at events, who gets to participate at events, whether it's virtually, whether it's in person. There are some interesting questions around the kind of resourcing and the trajectories of people's careers across the field. And I thought that some of the points Connie made, particularly at the beginning, those points about what it's like to increasingly be an adjunct, a casual staff member, the role of unions, the role of support networks, again, to pick up on one of Catherine's points around affect and affectionality and all of those kinds of different areas about how people get burnt out, how they get burnt by others in the field is one of those key things. Just as a kind of admission of my own mistake, Connie referenced something I'd written in an editorial, and for me, Cleo is always a woman. I didn't realise the person I was citing was a man by using a Cleo within that. And I was reminded by some of my seniors that I should probably check who's the face behind the author, not just make assumptions. And I thought that was something I had to learn, so I appreciate that. And then going back to some of the points that Irene has made there, I think one of the key things which we try to do with the Research Symposium, and whether it's through the panels or whether it's through the social events or whether it's through the caucus meetings or all sorts of different spaces, is really get to that question about what's really worth researching these days. And again, I'm reminded that in a way, all three of you have said this, but I know that these words often speak to some of the questions that Connie's raised in the past. It's that kind of so what question. And one of my colleagues at Monash University, Neil, and I forget his surname on the top of my head for the moment, but that what, so what, and then the third point is now what, is one of those things which this research symposium was encouraging us to get to. And again, the kind of now what next for the next 10 years, the next 40 years, is one of the things we're hoping that today's event can get us to. So we have had some questions posted, and I'd just like to start by asking the panel members about what is something that they hope the research community will be reflecting on over the next year before the next event happens. So Connie, while we might have sound for you.
Here we go. I got sound. Sure. Okay, sure. You had suggested that might be a question, so I thought a little bit about it. And, you know, this fits totally with what I was already saying in my remarks. I'd like to see more attention to addressing who and what. So I appreciated your comment about barnacles, Alan. What remains at the margins of our field? I love, Kathy Yoon, that you're actually looking at barnacles, at critters without faces, the non-charismatic critters. So that excited me. So that doing this might mean that we need to build on insights from past work on decolonizing EE, queering EE, feminist EE, or work in our field on environmental justice, poverty, disability, fat phobia, animality, for example. And I think we also need to discuss specific strategies to tackle marginalization, because we can identify a problem, but what exactly are we going to do about it? And I want to be clear that this is something that all of us need to be pondering, not just those of us who are intrinsically interested in this topic. It's not only up to those whose voices and perspectives have been marginalized to address the topic. For example, as a white person, I need to reflect on whether I've only built on the scholarship of other white people and what that might mean for the quality of my work and the relevance of my work. And if I don't do that, I think that I'm complicit in perpetuating marginalization. So I'd like us to think about concrete strategies we could come up with in terms of addressing some of those problems.
Thanks, Connie. I think, again, that speaks to one of the things you've embodied so well in your career around careful scholarship, as well as inclusive and critical scholarship. And I think that kind of, it's not just for the next year, that's more of a lifetime commitment. So again, thank you for speaking to that and for raising that. Kathy Yoon.
Yeah, first of all, I want to address the barnacle comment. However jokey it was, it's really interesting to us to, we have been paying attention to the scholarship and the research around what animals feel and what animals feel towards humans, what animals feel towards each other. because in this like meta inception way, that helps us to build empathy for those animals. Because if people think that those animals have an affectivity and emotion towards each other and themselves, it lets us know better how to care for them and also know better how to relate to them and take their perspective. So just gonna throw that out there. But I think in answer to that question, you know, we live in such a ridiculous time. It's just a ridiculous time to be alive, right? And there's so much out there that is happening in analogous areas of social justice and gender and, you know, diversity scholarship. In the past year, I know my identity as a woman and my identity as a person of color has shifted dramatically. And I think there are analogs there that I don't quite understand yet, but hopefully in the next year we can figure it out, to how we can incorporate some of those larger, more popular conversations on justice into the environmental education realm. All over the place, we're seeing campaigns on Facebook where people are opening up about their identities, about their experiences around assault and around racism and around, you know, all of these incredibly powerful, difficult, hard topics. And I think however weird this time is that we're living in, something about it is bringing out people's passions and emotions. And I think we can use that to tie in and make environmental education even more relevant than it has ever been, because it is so closely tied to all of those other life experiences.
Great, thanks Kathleen for that. One of the things which that reminds me of is I was at the World Environmental Education Congress recently, which also had a Tbilisi plus 40 theme. And Chuck Hopkins, when speaking from the platform there, noted that in the Tbilisi discussions, one of the things they excluded and they regretted excluding was urban environmental education. And this was a tradition typically associated with some of the Northern European countries at the time, where through things like the Bulletin of Environmental Education and quite often an anarchist perspective, they were arguing that there were different approaches. It wasn't just about nature. Urban environments mattered, and that's where most people live. And that, in effect, was a blind spot. Again, one of the things which the kind of animal question raises is the whole matter of plant blindness. The field is very good at now including animals, but what other blindnesses do we need to recognise? And again, in the next year, 10 years or so, will we start recognising some of those things and beginning to move on from those? But I think just to give Aryan the last word on this particular question about hopes for what the research community might be reflecting on over the next year. Again, you have the theme of the Tbilisi plus 40 and the effect on the research community from there and onwards. I'm always tempted to ask the question, what would have happened if the Tbilisi documents didn't exist and we had in effect a blank sheet of paper? Would we have gone off in a very different direction? And is one of the hopes that kind of reinvention or the reinvigoration or the transgressing of the field in different ways? Over to you, Aryan.
Yeah, well, you know, what if questions I find hard. I mean, then it becomes very speculative. I'd rather pick up on the transgressive bit, I think. And I think we all seem to speak to some form of disruption and transgression indeed. So the question would be, what are maybe transgressive pedagogies that also require a different way of researching? And when we talk about, say, critical animal pedagogy or post-humanist perspectives or new materialist perspectives, then we are beginning to think about, and others have done this more already, and I'm just getting into this, also because in Gothenburg we have at the moment Helena Pedersen, a colleague of mine there, and we're having a debate, a discussion, just as an example, about whether or not or how to use the iAnimal tool, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a movie, short movie, about 8 minutes, made by animal rights groups. It's a 3D movie that you can see best when you wear these Google glasses or a type of glasses, and it takes you from conception to slaughter through the industrial pig farms. It's a composite film from different farms so that you cannot pinpoint where it came from. And the idea is that that students, learners, whoever they might be, wear that, and they walk through. And it is called Being a Pig, the module, and it's becoming uncomfortable together, about trying, and it has to do with empathy, it has to do with shock pedagogy, it has to do with disruption, it has to do with trying to have dialogue and conversations and about emotions that it leads to. It is about making the invisible visible, the hidden visible, that what we're not allowed to see, entering a world that is kept from us, and then thinking about, and this is a conversation that we have about how whether this is good education, this type of intervention, how to research what happens to ourselves when we enter that world. What does it do to us? What does it do to our relation with the non-human and the more than human? That is, I think, a new perspective, both on education and research, that we need to, I think, pay more attention to if we really want to transition away from these very resilient hegemonic structures that keep us kind of locked up in this, this unsustainability by default, and that. So I'm interested in seeing if we can, also through the networks that we are forming, also the Jeep, I think, can play a role in that. If we can network and connect some of these niches in research that are beginning to do that, and see if we can strengthen that and make it into a regime or even a whole landscape that represents that kind of transformative, transgressive, transboundary research.
Great, thank you, Ardoin, for that contribution. I just want to thank all of the people who are taking part in this online, and really appreciate all of the comments you're posting and the suggestions for follow-up readings, further resources, ideas for different types of questions and ways of defining different terms and terminologies and all those kinds of things. So do really appreciate those. And just to remind people, there'll be a copy of this recorded and posted, and again a space there for people to post other reflections and thoughts on this. And again, I know that the panelists are able to see some of those questions too, and we do appreciate those. I think just as a kind of flag as we move to the next part of our event here, to me, just as the thing I've learned from that is much more about that renewed emphasis over the next year or few years on thinking about the kind of embodied aspect of doing research and not being disembodied researchers. It's too easy to live in a world of text. Sometimes, again, we privilege things like the equivalent of just eyesight, what we see, what we don't see, the blindness, what we hear, what we don't say in terms of voice. But there are other things about what we touch and what touches us, what we shouldn't and shouldn't touch. Other senses you can imagine just playing around with those notions, just to get us to think differently about who we connect with, who we don't connect with, who we shouldn't connect with, and who we should start doing that. And that, in a way, is where we're thinking about the future of the field. And some of you who've been to the recent events will know that at the San Diego event in 2015 and at the Madison event in 2016, we talked about different scenarios for the future for the NAAEE Research Symposium. We've asked people in a kind of participatory format which kind of future they'd prefer. We've reported back on that. The we here is Nicole and I, talking about some of the different scenarios people would like to support, what they'd like to avoid, what they think is important, where their preferences are, and beginning to work on how we flag those. And again, if you've looked at the Research and Evaluation EE Pro Group, you'll see the report on the voting and people's comments and reflections on those scenarios. And just if you, again, as a quick summary of those, the scenarios people did want to see more of an emphasis on in the next few years was on things like connecting with climate change education and action as a key focus within the research community, and that which is represented by the EU Research Symposium for NAAEE, but also re-environmentalizing education and thinking more about education quality and transformation. And I think just with the kinds of comments that Ardoin's made there and referencing the GEM report earlier on, the link with the SDGs and SDG 4 and quality education there, thinking with and beyond some of the discussion points which that's raised, but also seeing the events as taking place in places and providing a hub for place-based community environmental education research. And many of us were shocked by the events which happened in Puerto Rico and would have welcomed the opportunity to figure out ways to support people if we had had the event there. And I think, again, thinking forward to the next year, not just seeing this as a past event, or we don't have to think about Puerto Rico anymore, but carrying with us some of the concerns, that recognizing how that's affected us, but also how we can be effective in the communities within which the conferences are located, which gets us to that kind of point about, in the slides there, about what's healthy, productive and generous, what is desirable as qualities within the research community. And again, just to flick back to some of the themes which have come up in recent discussions around this, definitely for many in the research community, there is that sense that we need strong theoretical foundations. We need to be well read and be well read, if that makes sense. We need to read lots of work and also read each other's work to get to know each other, but also go beyond what we normally read, perhaps, and break out of some of the silos in that. But also thinking about the broader education community, and as Ardoin has mentioned, that kind of transgression, the transitions which we can make by partnering and cooperating with others who perhaps take a social justice or an ecological justice perspective, but start from a different place, or embody a different type of community, or recognise diversity in a different way, perhaps aren't always pursuing an academic orientation, to go back to Connie's point about what it means to be on the verge of taking a career or not. Again, academics aren't necessarily the best people to talk to about research. Again, I've been reminded about the research symposium which happened at the World Environmental Education Congress, where Alex Wilson made the point that sometimes Indigenous communities don't want to be researched anymore because it doesn't do them any favours. And so addressing those kinds of things can be an important part of the conversation, but also what we need to feel and do in our ways forward. So again, to flag some of the things that we'll be talking about in one of our next events, our next webinars online, is we'll be looking about the kind of organisational cultures of research communities and how those foster high quality research, and what are some of the barriers and enablers to that. We've talked before in various subgroups and in the EE Pro group and other spaces about a focus on culture and also a focus on strategy, and revisiting some of the purposes and understandings and practices of research within our own institutions, our own networks, but also what the Research Symposium can model, and again, where it needs to get to and what it needs to leave behind in some aspects of that. But also, again, thinking about strategy, about what's desirable, credible and worthwhile in this area, and that kind of hard one about working through what is urgent and what's important, or what's just urgent or what's just important. And is it the intersection of those is where the research community needs to go. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on some of those things there, but also that kind of wider question of how that links into what we know as the characteristics of a healthy organisational culture within, say, NAAEE's Research Symposium, and whether it mirrors or mimics some of the things which it perhaps should or shouldn't do, which again speaks back to the contributions we've had from our speakers today. I think within this, there's often those hard questions that sometimes we don't talk necessarily about what we envy or what we struggle with and how we address those. There are things, as have been flagged in these conversations, where people do steal each other's work. They do get caught up in bad practices. Again, shifting from a bad practice to a better practice, not necessarily a best practice, that might be a bit of a long way off, but recognizing that this might take time and that it might take a lot of care and it might take a lot of thought and compassion and strengthening of those who don't yet feel that the Research Symposium is for them. So again, those are the types of things that we'll be focusing on in our next event. And again, we will be trying to make sure that this is a participatory approach. We'll be polling you on some thoughts and reflections, and hopefully finding different ways of, again, mainstreaming that into some of the events of the Research Symposium. Okay, so look out for the notifications for that. What I'd really like to do now is, while we've still got Connie Russell on the line, remind people about one of the benefits of having the Research Symposium and the research community at NAAEE is each year we get to discuss the nominations for the Outstanding Contributor to Research in Environmental Education Award. That's presented, as I said, each year, and if you go to the EE Pro website, you'll see a long list of award winners from pretty much the start of NAAEE, going back to the 80s, and a long roll call of people who have either been doing things which have fostered better approaches to conducting research of a substantial nature that contributes to the theory or the practice of the field, or both. The way they've gone about making a significant contribution by reporting research at professional conferences or in refereed journals or in other research publications. Or again, another category for the Outstanding Contribution Award is about how an individual has promoted environmental education research through different activities, such as serving on research committees, being on an editorial board of a research publication, teaching, serving on thesis committees, all sorts of different things which might improve the capacity of the field to research things which are worthwhile within the field and not get bogged down perhaps in some of the concerns which aren't there. So as you'll see on the slide there, it's wonderful to be able to announce that the award winner, and in the 30th anniversary of this award, is our very own Connie Russell from today's session. As you can see from some of those quotes there, and these are just a couple of the many, many accolades and supportive comments that we've heard in soliciting people's views forward. And I think you can use the chat function as well to signal your applause too, as well as audio. So that's fantastic. But as you can see here, there's some wonderful reflections from people about what's going on in and through the work that Connie has championed and spearheaded over many years. And I know that Connie will be the first to say it's not just Connie. It's many others have done this kind of work, but it's the connectedness of Connie to many and knowing what's going on, which is so gratifying to see in the nomination this year and the letters of recommendation which we've seen for that. So again, before I hand over to Connie just to say a few words about this as this year's award winner, can I just remind people who are participating today that each year you can nominate an individual. There is an online form which allows people to make a nomination and submit material there. We had a few teething issues this year in setting up, but we think it's a much smoother process than before. And again, you can find out about how votes are cast, how the panel works. Again, it was a privilege this year for me to serve as the chair of the panel. I'd like to thank the panel members who took part this year, and again, all of the people who contributed to the process on the front and also behind the scenes. But again, it's with great pleasure that I'm delighted to announce that Connie has won the award this year. And I'd like to hear just a few reflections from Connie on this award. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Ellen, and thank you for the few of you who were clapping and showing your fingers. That was lovely. A little bit different than it would have been in Puerto Rico, but I have to say this is really quite lovely, so thank you. I'm delighted and deeply honored to receive this award. I pestered Ellen to find out who was actually behind the nominations so I could thank them. So just let me take a moment to publicly thank Justin Dillon, Bob Stevenson, Paul Hart, Joe Ferreira, Lisa Fawcett, Teresa Laura Bydart, Bob Coulter, Lex Scully, Annette Goff, and Noel Goff, who all had different parts to play in that process. I feel really fortunate to be part of such a supportive research community. Alan asked me to say a few additional words about my hopes for environmental ed research, so I'll just take a couple of minutes to do that now. As I said in the webinar, we need to continue to attend to whose voices and which perspectives, theoretical traditions, and methodological approaches continue to be marginalized in our field, why that's the case, and what we can do about it. There's been a significant blossoming in the past 20 years, as Ardoin made clear, but there's definitely room for growth. Also, as I mentioned in the webinar, I'm concerned about the neoliberalization of the academy and its impacts on our field. And this mirrors what's happening in our wider social context, of course. It makes very clear to me the importance of moving beyond the low-hanging fruit, to use Alan's phrase, and working to get at deeper root problems underlying the environmental and social problems we are facing. It really is way past time to move beyond simplistic models of environmental learning that persist in our field. As I say to my students, if nature experiences or experiences with other animals automatically disrupted anthropocentrism, or if knowledge really did magically lead to pro-environmental behavior, if learning were really that simple, we wouldn't be in the mess that we are in now. So we need to continue to dig way more deeply. We also need to ensure that our research really does reach beyond our borders. Nicole and her colleagues' recent work on writing environmental ed research briefs for a wider audience is a great example of just such an effort. We need to reach and engage with wider audiences. And obviously, I don't mean simply one-way communication here. We need to work with our partners, our communities on the ground to make a material difference in the world. We also need to do a better job of reaching into other fields within education, as well as with other disciplines. We need to reach out to kindred spirits, both within and beyond the academy, so that we can form coalitions and work together on projects of mutual importance as part of a politics of solidarity. That being said, doing so raises questions that I think warrant greater consideration in the field, such as the tension between education and advocacy, or the idea of scholarship as activism, which seems especially pertinent in these troubled times. Now, I'm going to close by being a little morbid. I'm getting to the age where the death of family and friends is becoming a semi-regular occurrence, so perhaps it's not surprising that I'm increasingly aware of my own mortality. The poet Mary Oliver asks a question I find myself continually returning to. She asks, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Each of us have limited time on this planet, so Oliver's question demands that we ask of ourselves, what are we doing with our lives, including in our roles as researchers? Are we engaged in busy work? Are we conducting research that is not personally meaningful or that is unlikely to make a difference socially or environmentally because someone told us it would be a strategic move? Are we in fact devoted to selfish careerism? Are we fiddling while the world burns? So I ask you, what are your passions? What are your gifts? What privileges do you have that you can spend as an environmental education researcher? As a field, we've done tremendous work, but there's so much more left to do ensuring that all of us, humans, other animals, the planet, can flourish. So I'll close there now. Again, thank you so much for honoring me with this award.
Thank you so much, Connie, and huge congratulations to you again. So well deserved, and we are just so fortunate to have incredible researchers, colleagues, mentors, and friends like you in the field. And thank you so much, Ardoin, Kathleen, just really moving thoughts. You gave us a lot of food for thought for the next year. And thank you, Alan, for really great thoughts and great questions there. And I really appreciate what you've given us to look forward to in the next webinar. We hope that all of you will join us for the next webinar. We had some questions about whether this recording will be available online. It will. And we appreciate so many of you joining us here today. We look forward to seeing you in Spokane next year, and we look forward to seeing you on EE Pro between now and then. And as you can see here, we'll be continuing the discussion related to the Sustainable Development Goals and so many other things on EE Pro. thanks so much to everyone for hanging in there with us, and also to the NAAEE staff and Judy. All of you are just a really terrific community for us. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone. And congratulations, Connie. Have a great night, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.